the 18th of April, 2023. Hope everybody's doing reasonably well. I had no idea why that happened, by the way. But it happens, so that's a good thing. I'm Dana Durnford. I'll try that again. There we go. I'm also known as nuclearproctologist.org. You can call in at 709-589-4406. On this dusty Tuesday. We got a news cycle, 24-hour news cycle, ready to go. We got a poll. It's ready to go. Our Fukushima 750 tanks, because you say there's 1,000, but we counted them. There's only 750. Our Fukushima 750 tanks meant to trick you into complacency, into thinking that nuclear hasn't destroyed the entire Pacific Ocean. And if you voted yes, or if you voted, I guess, because everything is yes, you were correct. Thank goodness. Don't ask me what's going on here. A little bit of everything. I think that's where we're supposed to be, right here. So that poll has been backed up by scientific data. So if you think about the research expeditions that we have done, what you'll notice is this is a map from British Columbia, Canada, on your bottom right hand side to Alaska. And I have went back there year after year after year. The species to your left are officially exterminated. That's due to the radioactive fallout from Japan. And so it was trading all the species to your left, which was the entire coastline of the west coast of North America looked like it, but certainly Canada. Look at the species to your left. It was just every millimeter was taken up by life. Now there's at best a couple of algae to your right. The pictures to your right are pictures that I took. 6 years of doing research expeditions. The pictures to your left, you'll never take them again. They're actually exterminated due to the radioactive fallout from Japan. And we know this because year after year, after year after year, it seems like forever, I went all the way up to Alaska each year. And what I discovered was quite shocking. And we repeated it year after year to see if the species to your left came back. The species didn't come back. And that is because of radioactive fallout. And so a lot of the clouds are coming in with heavy radioactivity, and they hit the Rocky Mountains, the Cascades. And they're very heavy clouds because they're carrying a lot of water too. And so when you hit the Cascades, they lose a lot of water, the Rocky Mountains. They'll lose probably 70% of their water. And then they'll rise up and they'll go over the mountains to the interior of the continent. And that water, a lot of it eventually run all the way back down to your tidal zones, to your coastlines. And so that's why the coastlines are so important, because they're very vulnerable. As you can see, the species that you're looking at are very vulnerable because they're exposed twice a day to the atmospheric radioactive fallout. And because you're talking about a very complicated thing to do is these research expeditions, There's 27,000 islands. And so the ocean has to go through certain pinch points to get to the island. So when it first meets the coastline of the northern America, there's the outside west coast islands. They're going to be the worst hit, theoretically, right? That's what we postulated, or I postulated. And so I concentrated a lot of times in those areas, and in adverse conditions, the archipelagos, the islands, groups of islands, there's many groups of islands of 102 and 300 islands in behind the pinch points, for instance. And so in adverse condition, I can still research them, right? And the species were wiped out. So this is why we're going to poll. And such a sad poll. Are Fukushima's 750 tanks meant to trick you and to be complacent, thinking that everything is going into the tanks instead of what has already happened? And I'm just trying to set the stage so you can wrap your mind around it. It's not that you're incapable, it's just it's very complicated to flush out on your own. So the ocean, this model is 6 years of emissions into the ocean, but this is 19.5 days, 468 hours of radioactive fallout. Now it covers the whole planet immediately. So that's the Pacific, for instance. This is the Atlantic. You can see the plumes, by the way, don't stop. And they faked being in the reactors into the fuel pools, which would have been at the very top of the buildings. That's a depiction of reactor 4. This is what you see. There's two of those red depictions up there. That's the fuel pools. They would have been at the top of the buildings. And as you can see to your left, there is nothing left to the building. So they decided to fake it, and if that's the official picture of the inside of reactor 4, which is right there. And they also done the same thing with reactor 3. But that radiation fallout was immediate. Within 2 weeks, the entire continent of North America was a continuous plume. It wasn't like there was a cloud of radiation moving. This was a continuous plume covering the entire planet at the same time. And if it had just stopped coming out, say, in this model is 26 days, I believe, of radioactive fallout. This is based on TEPCO's numbers, by the way, from a major institution. The modeling is done. There's so many of these. Now we have the studies quantifying. That's the fake picture of reactor 3. So your media for 80 years have told you this particular lie, and there's many other facets to that lie, like climbing mountains, sleeping next to somebody, where they conflated and equated natural stuff with anthropogenic man-made stuff. And they, it's over a decade of doing that to you, so it's very effective. So when they say 1,000 tanks, of course, I got to go count the tanks because I'm silly like that. And I have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pictures of the tanks, by the way. We've been doing this forever. And what we discovered was it was only 750 tanks if you include the small tanks, and so I did. I'm going to run it back for the next 15 minutes because there's a lot of news right now about the tanks. Now I have multiple videos in the playlist specifically dedicated to explaining the tanks to you. This show is also going to cover the nuclear cycle, news cycle for the last 24 hours. And so if you really are intrigued and you want to learn the actual facts with the documentations to back up my assertions, I suggest you, at your convenience, peruse my playlist. And there's multiple videos that will get you extremely articulated in a very short period of time, I hope. That's the intentions. And I do believe it will. If you can tie your own shoes, you can work this out with the videos. TEPCO releases video of groundwater entering crippled. This is a nuclear meltdown, not crippled. The word crippled is a substitute for nuclear wastelands. TEPCO's released a video of the groundwater entering the nuclear wastelands Fukushima Daiichi complex. I'm not going to call it crippled because that's an insult to you, for me and you to buy into that narrative. Radiation levels from the storage tanks used to store thousands of tons of radioactive water. So all those tanks that are on site. Should remind me, I should bring that into the equation, shouldn't I? I forgot to fire that up. Bear with me. Biggs. Oh my God, I don't know where the tanks are today. I finally lost it. Finally brain dead. Oh, there it is, right where it's supposed to be. But I am brain dead. I'm only good for one thing now, is research in nuclear. That seems to be the only thing that I'm capable of doing. And so if you fill up the tanks with 2.2 sieverts per hour, so what that means is a liter, if you stay there for 25 minutes, you'll die somewhere in the next couple of weeks. If there's 2 liters there, and you stay there for 10 minutes, you're going to die somewhere in the next couple of weeks. If there's 5 liters there, and you walk past it, you'll die that day. So imagine filling the tanks up. So as soon as you fill up one tank, it's this is only beta, by the way, that we're talking about. They're acknowledging, because there's alphas and gammas and neutrons, and by proxy then X-rays. They're extremely bad for all species, particularly insects and birds, stuff like that, and children, obviously, of all species. If you fill up one of the tanks, you can't build another tank anywhere on the site. And you're like, Dana, that's a big site, Dana. Yeah, but 1.4 million sieverts, the tanks would have to be 6 feet to 12 feet thick to protect you. So 2.2 sieverts per hour in the tank means you can never, if you empty the tanks and you fill the tanks up with fresh water after having 2.2 sieverts per liter of just beta, it's infinitely more than that, because you can't exclude alphas and neutrons and gamma. And so you can't build another tank on site. So that's part of the problem when I'm looking at this equation, is how can they have tanks full of that? Now this is on a fault line where there's each year there's a vicious earthquake, which is overdue currently, that does around $5 billion worth of damage to everything else but ground zero 30 kilometers away from the earthquake. But hundreds of miles away, it'll rip schools in two and everything else. But not the nuclear site itself, apparently. It's immune to earthquakes, they say, which is nonsense, obviously. Well, that's what the industry is really good at, is nonsense. And you got you into complacency now for 80 years. I'm trying to break that Stockholm syndrome. So if they have an earthquake, these tanks are flimsy tanks. They're bolted together. They're very fragile. And if you have a full of absurd numbers, one of these bust open, even if you could fill them up, if one of them bust open, that means you have to abandon the site. But you can't be on the site if you got one of them filled up, because you're 1.4 million. 3 sieverts is a lethal dose to a human. What do you think 1,000,000.4 is going to be? Multiply it by 4 because you got to include gammas and alphas and neutrons and X-rays. TEPCO plans to dump the water stored at Fukushima Daiichi into the Pacific 2013. The plant had already released enormous amounts of highly contaminated water directly into the ocean from a plethora of leaks from the reactor buildings. Gee, I wonder what they're trying to tell us. So how can it be in the tanks if it's released enormous amounts of water in 2013? The tanks were built at the one time to confuse you, by the way. After the water passes through the crippled nuclear meltdowns, aka crippled, you know, nuclear meltdowns. They're not crippled, they're nuclear meltdowns. And every time you hear a journalist, which is no problem stabbing you in the back, say that, you need to ask yourself that question. It is processed through the Ceres system, which allegedly was the great cesium remover. And cesium is the cover story for radioactive emissions for 80 years. And most of the studies will only acknowledge cesium. Everything has to come from uranium. There is no cesium going into the reactor. It's what comes out. But the biggest byproduct, and cesium is really bad, don't get me wrong, but you got to consider all the other isotopes, my goodness. And you got to consider that the biggest byproduct of the radiated fuel rods are going to be curium isotopes, which is why we call it a curium core after the meltdown. It's because the biggest byproduct, not a cesium core, but a curium core, which is the biggest byproduct of radiated fuel rods, and all of it decays to plutonium, I might add, eventually. Other systems, which is the ERIVA and the ELP system, for instance. ERIVA was the French water filtration, ELPS, and we're going to get to that right away for you. Design and remove other radioactive materials have been overwhelmed by the complexity and concentration. Now the problem is, at 2.2 sieverts an hour, you're putting that into a filter at 1,000 liters, just only acknowledging beta, is over 2,400 sieverts. So that's a lethal dose after an hour. And they claim they can do more than that per hour. So the problem is the filter needs to be 6 or 8 feet thick to shield anybody that's within a couple of 100 feet of it, let alone in the building. So it can't physically work because of that particular attribute. It can't be filtered. Because you have to change the filter every 6 minutes or something with a robot, because humans can no longer go near any, even fractions of the numbers we're talking about. So imagine if you let it run for 10 hours or 20 hours or 2 weeks like they claim before they change the filter. You can't get back in the building. Okay, so, which is one of the reasons we got a poll. Are Fukushima 750 tanks meant to trick you into being complacent and thinking that nuclear hasn't destroyed the entire Pacific ecosystem? We got a good poll tonight. We got 22 likes and 22 votes, which is extraordinary numbers to be the same. We never see that. It's extraordinary. It's only when we're extremely controversial subjects. Okay, so if everything is in the tanks, how do you explain United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation in 2012 showing all of these communities? This was the disposition per square. Now, 10,000 becquerels is considered highly contaminated. And all of these communities, I'm just going to show you a fraction of these communities. All of these communities are over 10,000 becquerels of just gamma, just cesium. There's many different gammas, by the way. So the list of communities like this goes from A to Z. So how can you have everything in the tanks if the whole country looks like that? How's that actually work? Right, remember the tanks. The tanks were built to manipulate you. You couldn't build another tank alongside of a tank with 2.2 sieverts per liter, where they only acknowledge beta, which is criminal. They only acknowledge beta, by the way. Deliberate extermination of the species and humanity is what we're looking at with this industry. But it's been going on for 80 years. All nuclear power plants are surrounded by farms. Fukushima Prefecture requests Japan's government remove TEPCO from management. You know why? Because TEPCO is not a decommission authority. It is no secret that Tokyo Electric is incapable of containing the disaster at the Fukushima Daiichi. Is incapable. And as I showed you, the communities are incredibly radioactive. The first line is the name of the community. The second line is the people in the community. The third line is the becquerels. And they claim that the absorbed doses to the red bone marrow literally almost don't exist in any of these communities. Because they're going to flip from becquerels, which is physical atoms that you can breathe in or consume or eat or absorb with showers or whatever, with emitters, which is microsieverts and millisieverts and stuff like that. So in the communities, which is far away from the reactors, this is physical radioactive fallout. So whenever you hear them talking about millisieverts, microsieverts, and radioactive fallout, they're lying to you, because there is no such thing. You would count it in atomic decays per second, like they're doing in that map up right there. You'll get there, don't worry, if you're not familiar with this stuff. I'll get you there. You'll be way better off for it, and nobody can trick you anymore. 2013 August, Fukushima Prefecture requests the Japanese government remove TEPCO from the management. We just covered that thing, didn't we? Yes. Sue me. TEPCO to abandon their Areva system. This was France. Fake system amid the contaminated water crisis. So 2014 in August, just 3.5 years, the Areva system has been kept out of operation for over 3 years. So it didn't work at all because of what I just told you. Where if you did try to use it, you have to abandon it. And that the hoses coming into it at 2.2 sieverts are just beta. Let's pretend alphas and neutrons and gammas don't exist. You won't be able to step over the hose without getting a lethal dose anywhere on site. Tanks were built hastily to hold highly contaminated water, which leads to a variety of leaks. They were built hastily to hold a highly, not filtered, but highly contaminated water. So that was the Areva Francis system. The ELP system, 2014, just a couple of days away from that anniversary there. The advanced liquid processing system is yet to function reliably. Well, it has yet to function. So you got the Areva system didn't function. The ELP system rather didn't function 3 years after. The Areva system didn't function 3.5 years later. The Siri system didn't function. Siri, where are you to? You're back there somewhere, I'm sure. Yeah, the Siri system didn't work. Because, like, this was designed to make you complacent, the same as the tanks. So at 100 million becquerels per cubic centimeter, which is a really unusual way to actually talk about contaminated water in the quantities that we're talking about. It's extraordinary. They're doing that because they don't want to say what it is, right? For the sludge, Well, the sludge is the radioactive particulates. So it can start its own chain reaction once it turns into sludge and burn a hole through the tank, which is what we've seen in Mayak in the former Soviet Union and in Fukushima, Hanford, nuclear disaster. The nuclear laboratories, international nuclear laboratories, are Superfund sites by proxy because they were built for the legacy waste of Manhattan projects and places like this. And so this stuff is so toxic. If you ceased all production at the site, it would be deadly for millions of years on that site. TEPCO says groundwater bypass operation is not having an effect. This is where they were going to build dams, so to speak, on the mountainside to stop water from ingressing the site. TEPCO failed to deliver promise to install a fence to restrict contamination from leaking. So when you hear the word leaking, you should be furious. You should be absolutely furious that they used that word. TEPCO's ice walls are not meeting expectations, so why would you build an ice wall instead of a real wall, right? So it's not meant to work. TEPCO's communication was severed after evacuating critical workers from the plant. What was the date on that? 2012, December. Which had continued to release radioactive materials directly into the atmosphere for the last 21 months. So if it's releasing for 21 months straight at that point, how can it all be in the tanks? If the ice wall doesn't work, how can it be in the tanks? Right? How can it be in the tanks? And if you fill the tank up, this is Photoshop. I don't know why they photoshopped it, but these are photoshopped. One guy pointing this way, one guy pointing that way, the other guy looking like he's walking, but you can't walk in that posture unless you're a monkey or something, right? The paper suit can't protect you from anything. Even if you fill this up with so-called low-level waste, you still can't be protected in a paper suit, right? And these paper suits are always perfect, never torn, never dirty. TEPCO allegedly burned 7,000 of these paper suits a day. And because I used to shit on them a lot about the 7,000 suits, and so they started reporting that they burned 7,000 of these suits in the on-site incinerators. All nuclear plants have incinerators, by the way. Hang on, we're almost there. So how can, if the groundwater bypass operation doesn't work, how can everything be in the tanks, right? If they fail to deliver a fence to stop the radiation from going into the ocean, how can everything be in the tanks? Which is why we got a poll tonight, coincidentally. Just total coincidence. Our Fukushima 750 tanks, but they claim they got 1,000 tanks. We counted them as 750 tanks. Are they to trick you into thinking that the nuclear hasn't destroyed the entire Pacific ecosystem? Japan may have to change decontamination efforts after labor shortage. Where did I get the last one? Yeah, we got that one. Airborne for the last 21 months. So how can you have it airborne for the last 21 months, but it's all in the tanks? Right? Japan may have to change decontamination efforts after labor shortage. Most of facing serious problems, most of which seems to be their own creation. Reality, decontamination efforts to date have been relatively ineffective, and as some argue, a complete waste of money. So 2013, how can you have everything in the tanks when it's called a complete waste of money? How can it all be in the tanks when it's considered a complete waste of tax funds? Because remember, the REVA system in 2014 didn't work. The ELP system in 2014 didn't work. The Siri filtration system 2014 didn't work. In reality, wages for the workers are almost the same as those for regular construction. Notice all the people in the perfect paper suits at nuclear meltdowns. Now, if I include those tanks, you got 750 tanks. It's a far cry from the numbers they're claiming. They're all built basically in 2013. In reality, wages for the work is almost the same as those for regular construction. TEPCO investigates radiation levels of the exhaust stacks. The exhaust stacks, which are those tall stacks they normally vent the fuel pools up. Estimated that around 25 sieverts per hour near the surface. I don't know, because it kills you right away, right? So if you can't get near the stacks, how can you fill all those tanks up and get near them when they're 1.4 million sieverts per tank of just beta, which you got to multiply it by 4 to get alphas, neutrons, gammas, and X-rays, because you can't just have beta. TEPCO began work on the underground ice wall 2014. TEPCO, which is not a decommissioning authority, shouldn't be in charge, and that way you don't blame the international energy agencies, the nuclear industries, right? And the people that make it, and that make the reactors, most importantly, because they're always hemorrhaging radiation from fuel pools. Enormous amount of coolant water, enormous amounts. Normally the reactor needs 4,500 tons a minute. Enormous amounts of coolant water injected. They're not injected, they're sprayed. You can't inject anything. These are nuclear meltdowns. You can't get near them to inject something. They're just randomly sprayed on the buildings. To prevent the melted fuel from overheating is leaking from the damaged reactor containment vessels. And as I showed you earlier, the containment vessels don't exist. And mixing with the groundwater in the reactor building, turbine buildings, and various underground tunnels before seeping. The word seeping, you know, at the top of it got an enormous amount of water, but now it only seeps into the ground and reaching the sea. And so the contempt that they have for you and all the species, there's nothing like it else. No other industry on the planet has this kind of contempt. Workers are unable to access the underground tunnels due to the high radiation levels from the contaminated water, and will be forced to perform their work using remote control cameras. So how can it all be in the tanks? You know, the 750 tanks, if you include those small ones. And we do. TEPCO says it's running out of room to store the contaminated debris. So contaminated debris. Contaminated. It's radioactive on a whole different scale, by the way, radioactive. So probably the worst thing you can do with that stuff is burn it, right? Well, that's what they've done. Tokyo Electric believes they can reduce some 340,000 cubic meters of debris, aka contaminated debris, radioactive debris, by burning the wood debris, radioactive wood, and radioactive combustible materials at a nuclear meltdown, and then crushing the stuff they can't burn. Now it's contaminated, crushing the contaminated. But the wood is 340 tons they're talking about that they burnt is the radioactive. This is dirty bombs by the kilogram you're talking about. And crushing contaminated rubble used to pave the roads on the site. So if you took that and crushed it and took it to a site, say in Canada or United States, and paved the roads within the plant with that stuff, and like use it as even a base and put pavement over it, you wouldn't be allowed to get into the community 20 miles up the road. So do you really think there's any nuclear scientists walking around that plant? Does it sound like it's all in the tanks to you? Because that's what we're going to pull tonight. Is everything in the tanks? Ambassador Kennedy toured Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant with her son, no less, Caroline Kennedy. Spent 3 hours pretending she's at reactor 4, overseeing the spent fuel removal from reactor 4. I find that extraordinary. I find it extraordinary because the building is to the right, not the left, which is Arnie Gunnison, by the way, is pretending it's in. So she's, who knows where she's to, but it ain't Fukushima Reactor 4, obviously. But that was weaponized, and he made that claim, but Reactor 4 doesn't even exist, let alone the top part of it where the fuel pool would have been. TEPCO's ice wall operation not meeting expectations. In an attempt to stem the contaminated water from flowing into the Pacific. Flowing into the Pacific. So does flowing into the Pacific sound like it's in the tanks to you? They're going to build the ice wall to stop the contaminated water from flowing into the Pacific. So it can't be in the tanks and flowing into the Pacific, right? They're building the ice wall because it's been flowing. It's 2004, 14. It's still flowing into the Pacific. Into the Pacific. The Pacific. That's why we're going to poll tonight, right? Is... Are Fukushima 750 tanks meant to trick you into thinking nuclear hasn't destroyed the entire planet and the Pacific ecosystem? Well, actually, yes it is, Dana. That's amazing. Cesium found in Japanese steel exported to South Korea. Making kids' toys and frying pans and cooking utensils and everything else. So how did contaminated steel, how did it get contaminated? Well, where did it come from that it was so radioactive? South Korea had to return the contaminated steel to Japan. And again, they're only acknowledging cesium and cesium-137 in particular, which is that's an incredible insult for them to only acknowledge cesium or to imply that cesium was the only issue. That's absurd contempt. But how did it become the steel become radioactive if it was all in the tanks, right? TEPCO gets approval to release more Fukushima water into the Pacific. But wait a second. That can't be true. I thought it was all in the tanks. Listen, if those tanks were full and they thought that was radioactive water, there's zero possibility your Geiger counter with no leak would scream, run. Drop me and run. That's what your Geiger counter would say on the screen. Drop me and run as fast as you can the direction you just came from. In your paper suit. TEPCO gets approval to release more radioactive water into the Pacific. 2015. More. The utility hopes to be able to process and dump 150 to 300 tons of contaminated water each day. Well, wait a second. I thought it was in the tanks, Dana. How can it be in the tanks if they're dumping it in the ocean, if it's flowing in the ocean from underground, if they're dumping it in from above ground? Japan's working to speed up the decommissioning of Fukushima Daiichi reactors. Japan. The only problem is they're getting paid, the homeless, the destitute, the victims of society, immigrants who don't speak the language, are getting $11 a day, U.S. $11 a day. Does that sound like nuclear scientists to you? Mom, we got to start up a GoFundMe for the nuclear scientists at Fukushima. They're only getting $11 a day for sacrificing themselves. Does that sound like the Fukushima 50 to you? Do you think that people getting paid $11 a day at multiple nuclear meltdowns, 8 detonated fuel pools, with each of them with decades of reactor cores, do you think the people there are worried about putting something in a tank? Do you think $11 a day is enough to motivate them to make sure everything is in the tank? In Fukushima City, it's 50 kilometers away, 90,000 houses are eligible for decontamination. 90,000 houses. That's all of them, by the way, in Fukushima City. So far, which is 300,000 people, I think it is. So far, only 4,000 houses have been cleaned. Cleaned. You can't clean a house that's radioactive. And when you got 90,000 houses that are so radioactive, they qualify for, are eligible for decontamination, that city is supposed to be razed to the ground. The victims are supposed to be quickly evacuated. And because the nuclear industry worldwide refused to let them do that, you should blame the nuclear industry worldwide with every fiber of your body. So if you're going to go decontaminate 90,000 houses 50 miles away, is everything in the tanks? At what point will the world say, you know, Dana might have a point? I'm not saying he does, but there's a possibility. But without being able to prevent the release of the radioactive material, you can't prevent the release of the radioactive material. Does that sound like it's in the tanks to you? You can't prevent the releases of the material, but it's all in the tanks for 12 years. Nothing's got out for 12 years. That's what the tanks are all about, right? Oh, it's all in the tanks. You got to worry about the future, not about the last 12 years, every second of every day. And you better worry about it. And you better start worrying soon, because you are running out of time. Whales and birds and seals and sea lions that are all emaciated are already running out of time. You really think you're not next? The release, without being able to prevent the release of radioactive material, the constant massive plumes is what they mean by that, from the crippled, the nuclear meltdown, not crippled, nuclear meltdown reactors, from being dispersed across the country. They don't make it a little tiny bit confusing. They make it impossibly confusing by 12 years of perpetual propaganda, right? So the average person has no hope of coming up on the subject and working it out on their own without finding someone like me. And unfortunately, I failed. I was hoping to create millions of little bastards just like me, and I didn't. Woe is me. And so I live in purgatory, where I have to come out and go to war every single day, every moment of every day, for you and your loved ones and the species, because nobody else has. And silence is unfortunately not an option. This model is based on 16 days of radioactive fallout. So here's what 16 days looks like. Well, that's 20 days, Dana. let's go there. So let's go 20 days. There's different models, right? So this is 20 days after the tsunami. The reactors detonated on, the last one's detonated on the 15th. So this is 15 days later now. And this is 16 days later. So you got a plume covering the entire planet in 16 days, right? Covering the entire planet in 16 days. So don't worry about that. Worry about the tritium that's going to get out in the tanks if they dump it in the water somewhere in the future. Worry about that. Don't worry about what's been happening. If you lived in Fukushima City, you would understand what I'm saying pretty quick, I would imagine. Because your house would be eligible, imagine that word, for decontamination of nuclear fallout. Does your insurance cover that, I wonder? Did you get that? Check your insurance policies. Make sure you got decontamination of your home. Regulators urge TEPCO to dump the tritiated water. Well, obviously you're not regulators. Non-regulatory agencies urge TEPCO to dump the tritiated water, which is a complete insult, into the Pacific Ocean 2013 in December. As soon as you look at him, if you were walking down the road and you've seen him on the same side walking towards you, he's from the International Atomic Energy Agency. If you were sensible, you would cross the street right away, right? They are seemingly just unable to prevent the eventual release of tritium. So claiming this is 2013, for goodness sakes. And we know the Siri didn't work, the Arriva system didn't work, the ELP systems had not worked even in 2014. And they were calling it tritiated water back then. It's humiliating, isn't it? That people like that actually exist. You can't prevent the eventual release of tritium water. Every time you hear tritium, that means they're lying to you. In comparison, the dump of the lying water will likely have a far smaller effect on the oceans than the continued outflow of contaminated water from the leaking. Does that look like it leaked to anybody? Or does that look like well, it was an event? If we wouldn't dump it in our lands, why should we dump it in our oceans? Because people don't know what's going on, right? They don't understand the very basics, because the industry is really good at confusing the population. It seems that the continuous batch release from contaminated water will become standard, because they've been doing it continuously at 2013. They're acknowledging it right there. So how can it be in the tanks if they're continuously batch releasing massive amounts? That's what a batch is, see? Leak of contaminated leak. Every time I hear the word leak, I'm just really disappointed. And we might as well get rid of the universities. They serve no purpose to us, right? It's like nuclear scientists. They have no purpose alive to anybody. At least dead, they would be fertilizers. So hopefully they get old and die soon, so we can use them for fertilizer for the species that are about to become extinct too. Leak of contaminated water. This is catastrophic water. At the Daiichi Unit 3, which is the MOX fuel facility, may have international safety impacts. A stream of water is not a leak, I might add. Nearly a foot wide, that's not a leak. Flowing to the first floor of the reactor building before escaping into a drain on the floor. After the investigation found that the water contained levels of radioactive material equal to the highly contaminated water that is accumulating in the basement of the reactor buildings, some 24 million becquerels per liter of beta ray emitting radioactivity, which includes strontium, 700,000 becquerels per liter of cesium-134, and 1.7 million becquerels per liter of cesium-137. So with these kind of numbers, it's going to be saturated with uranium and plutonium, curium isotopes. And is that 1,000 days? Yeah. So that's 1,000 days, which means strontium is peaked. After 1,000 days, the strontium will basically peak. And it's a 100-to-1 ratio to 137. And so you got to multiply for every 137. This is 1.7 million becquerels of liter of cesium, 137, would be 100 times that for strontium 90, which gets into the bones of all the species and mutates the stem cells, particularly the children of all the species, including humans. Tokyo Electric determined human error was the cause. Now, so at these numbers, how can it be in the tanks? You really think the people in the paper suit can deal with the numbers we're talking about? Is there anybody out there now, even in 2023, that's can't wrap their mind around the significance of what we're talking about? TEPCO Electric determines human error cause of the contaminated water leaking. It doesn't leak. These are not leaks. 240 million becquerels per liter. You can't call that a leak. It's infuriating they would use the word leak ever in these circumstances. It's infuriating. It's complete contempt for you and everybody else in the species. Saying the water had been partially treated in the nuclear disasters, partially treated, still got 240,000 becquerels of just beta ray. In 2014, when the REVA system didn't work, the ELP system didn't work, the Ceres system didn't work, how are you going to treat it? You can't treat that. The tanks are built to make you think that the ocean is not being destroyed. And 12 years later, I can guarantee you the ocean was destroyed. It's not going to be destroyed. It's already destroyed. The tritium is meant to make you complacent to those who are coming on board a decade, 12 years later. It's never too late to come on board. TEPCO officials cannot estimate how frequent water will be discharged from Fukushima Daiichi. For the next month, the radiation levels of stored water will be tested. If the groundwater contains less than 1 becquerel per liter of cesium, 1 becquerel, and cesium-137, 5 becquerels per liter of beta-emitted materials, and 1,500 becquerels of tritium per liter, it will be released. Now, I showed you this is absurd to suggest that these numbers are even conceivable anywhere, let alone at Fukushima. TEPCO is still struggling to keep their head above the contaminated water. The water samples taken from a cable trench on a reactor 2 turbine building, which is right down by the water, contain levels of radiation comparable to those seen in the first weeks of the nuclear disaster, aka multiple nuclear meltdowns. The laboratory test showed 8.7 million becquerels of tritium per liter. Now, the problem with that is they also had 2.35 billion becquerels of cesium, 750 million becquerels of other radioactive material in each liter of contaminated water. Well, the 750 million becquerels of the other stuff is going to kill the signal of the tritium. You're never going to hear tritium in that signal or register it on your sophisticated equipment. But 2.35 billion becquerels of cesium, there's zero possibility that you're going to be able to measure 8.7 million becquerels of tritium. Zero possibility. So why did they write that? Why did they announce that? Why did they put that there? It's 100% unequivocal, was to confuse those that might be paying attention and don't know any better. Are Fukushima 750 tanks to trick you into thinking that nuclear hasn't destroyed the entire Pacific ecosystem? And at the beginning of the video, I quantified that statement, right? And all the way up until right now. Ow. Let's try to cover some news. Korea imports a record amount of Japanese seafood, but they're telling the locals they're not bringing in Fukushima seafood. And Korea is pro-nuclear, a lot of pro-nuclear in South Korea. Environmentalist. So if you protest anything, you're an environmentalist. So only a protest or only an environmentalist can be a protester. No humans can be protesters, and no protesters can be humans because they're environmentalists. Right? First off, how come the journalist is not an environmentalist? How come the media is not environmentalist? Shouldn't they be excluded from everything because they don't have no... You don't need a journalist. What's the point of a journalist if a journalist is not going to inform the population? Which is what I do. For a lot of what I'm doing is forensic investigative journalism, because I'm trying to explain all these nuances, these minutiae of minutiae, these details of details. And bless the people's hearts for showing up in South Korea 12 years. Too late, but it's never too late. It's 12 years and you don't understand the big picture is what I meant by that. And so if these wonderful souls were to see this video translated into South Korean, then we can have a real blowback. That'll be the end of the nuclear industry for South Korea right away, because the majority of them go to college, where in North America maybe 6% goes to college. In South Korea it's around 75% goes to college. Seoul imported $48 million worth of fishery products despite saying that they're not importing anything from Fukushima. Now, we were covering stories last night where they're talking about the fishermen in Fukushima were fishing right out in front of Fukushima nuclear meltdowns. They can see the tanks, no problem. In other words, the import volume, the empty tanks I might add, the import volume during the same period also rose by 15%, reaching 7,669 tons, which is 15 million pounds. So you're not importing nothing, only, 15 million pounds for the first quarter. But no, we're not importing it. What are you doing? Because they're claiming they're not importing it, but yet there's 15 million pounds in the first quarter of 2023. High-risk seafood is entering Korea due to ineffective import controls. Ineffective. They're actually bragging about it in the media, for goodness sakes. Experts slam Japan's green transformation bill for protecting nuclear power industry. It was compiled by 20 individuals, including a lawyer who's the co-head of National Lawyers Association Against Nuclear Power. So there's a lawyer association in Japan against nuclear power. And they're not environmentalists, they're a lawyer. Safety costs at the nuclear plants in Japan exceeded $44 billion. Let's keep going. How Japan wound up stuck with tons, like 30 million tons. Some estimates are 60 million. They're claiming, I think, 14 million. 14 million of radioactive soil. How they ended up stuck with it. It's hard to wrap your mind around the disconnect, isn't it? These are supposed to be journalists. You got better chances of finding a dinosaur than you do of a journalist, right? You know that. A journalist is something out of a science fiction book. I heard about journalists. I've yet to find any, but I've heard about them. They eat lots of children's brains or something like that. I can't remember. So tons of Fukushima radio, tons. So all of those green tarps, by the way, each of these bags is a ton. So why not say thousands? At least give us that much instead of just tons. Why say just tons? And so below it says 14 million cubic meters. But why not, why not put that in the headline? Wouldn't that be more appropriate? Considering it's a hell of a lot more than 14 million tons. This is a Kuma, which is 2 kilometers north. It's connected at the hip to Fukushima Daiichi. It's abandoned. They're growing food there for the last number of years and shipping it, but it's abandoned. It is the planet's largest ever nuclear cleanup job. Well, they finally got something right. It's the first time in 2023 they said something true, actually. As Japan's authorities continue to dismantle the 4 reactors. The authorities! At the nuclear meltdowns. Dismantle. You can't dismantle it. These are nuclear meltdowns. These are lethal doses from very far distances. Nuclear. They crack me up sometimes. They're also trying to clear and store the tons, it's 30 million one-ton bags in 2019, I think it was. And we got some headlines here. We'll debunk what they're saying. Contaminated soil collected by the homeless, the destitute, the victims of society. The immigrants don't speak the language. Dozens of former fields filled rice paddies and hundreds of hectares of forests around the now disabled. Yeah, we should invent this new business we'll call the people that work for journalists, and they'll write stories like this, but they'll include the facts. You can't blame anybody for spitting on a journalist if you see one this day and age, can you? Someone says they're a journalist, like, spit right on them. Scumbag, get out of here. Because you know that's what I'm going to be saying. Get out of here, you scumbag. So there is no reactor. That's the stump of reactor 4, the ghost of reactor 4. You know, I got some short videos where I actually got myself down to the size of this, and I'm crawling out of the building there, looking for Seth Dorn from PBS. I can't find Seth. Anybody see Seth? Some funny shit. Those days are long gone. On a recent day, countless dump trucks, yeah, that's a little tiny bit accurate, excavators, bulldozers, and rollers compressed the soil in successive layers, building artificial hills 15 meters high. A sort of layered cake. So they're comparing millions of one-ton bags of radiation with layered cakes, which we eat cakes, right? Layered cakes. So what they're talking about is they're dumping the bags and then using excavators and everything to compress them. Collections began in 2015 in the villages of the area. No, it's multiple prefectures. It's the whole prefectures the bags are being picked up into. It's not the local villages. We have recovered a total of 14 million cubic meters, 14 million one-ton bags of contaminated soil. I'm not going to put you through all of it because I like you. I wouldn't do that to my worst enemy. So, the effectiveness of landscape decontamination following Fukushima nuclear accident. Decontamination activities generated 20 million cubic meters of soil waste by early 2019. That's a study, by the way. So that's a lot more than 14 million bags, and that's an extra 6 million bags that they left out of that previous story. The volume of the waste was decreased, or maybe decreased through incineration of combustible materials and recycling of the less contaminated soil. Well, the criteria for the bags was 100,000 becquerels per kilogram. That was supposed to be, these bags were supposed to be just temporary bags. So 20 million bags, but we got reports. We got reports of up to 60 million one-ton bags.
There's about 60 million tons of contaminated soil that's being stored, planned to be stored, outside the Fukushima Daiichi perimeter fence. So
60 million. Well, let's just say 30 million. So if there's 60 million or 30 million, it can't all be in the tanks now, can it? What's in the bag?
There's about 60 million.
What's in the bag if it's in tanks? Soil from Fukushima radiation decontamination work to be reused in farmland. In the difficult to return zone, so into the radioactive wasteland, they're going to use the soil that you picked up, the nuclear fallout soil, for farmland. Which brings another question of, how can everything be in the tanks how can it be in the tanks if it's in millions and millions of one-ton bags of radiation? So when, like, you're talking about so much radiation across the country, every time it rains, the whole country hemorrhages radiation into the Pacific, which is downhill from everything in Japan. But farmland and a no-go, difficult to return, which is a nuclear, terrible word, a phrase for nuclear wasteland. These are not difficult to return zones. These are nuclear wastelands. These are permanent no-go zones. You can't fix it. Plans to send the crops yield on farmland to the market in the future. And very few among the Japanese public know about the scheme. Because that's what it is. That's a scheme, right? Few in the public know about the scheme. It should be scam. Few in the public know about the scam to reuse. Hang on. Lost in translation here, I think. We'll get there. Bear with me. 30 kilometers from the nuclear meltdown. In the Nagadoro, which we covered last night, district of the village of Lydia, which we covered last night, because they opened up 3%. Not the farmland, because that's already open. We just don't want to go there, right? Which residents have been evacuated from since the onset of high radiation doses. Already picked up a million one-ton bags. Going to bring it back and dump it and grow food in it for sale for market, but the population doesn't know it. You do, but they don't. So And mounds of soil made of decontamination dirt. Decontaminated. This is not decontaminated. This is radioactive materials you picked up. You can't decontaminate dirt. With a radioactive cesium, and they're only going to acknowledge cesium, it's just to get rid of universities. With a radioactive cesium gamma concentration of 5,000 becquerels per kilogram or less, well, you got to multiply it by 64 to get a square meter. The standards limits set by the Environment Ministry, which is not nuclear experts, to have no repercussion for the workers, for the homeless and the destitute and the victims of society and the immigrants who don't speak the language. Today, the Nagadoro district is still uninhabitable due to the high radiation. So if it's uninhabitable due to the high radiation, then how can it all be in the tanks? Is that confusing, or am I confusing? Disposing of Fukushima contaminated soil, not like they claimed last story. There was currently, at that time, in 2019, went from 150,000 sites to 105,000 sites throughout the prefecture. So it's not the local towns like they were claiming in the second last story. You're talking about 105,000 sites in 2019. We're talking, the numbers we're talking about are absurd numbers. And that's one of the pictures of the Okuma site. It's where they're dumping the soil into the ground in unlined pits. It's much more complicated on top of everything else that I'm showing you. I'm just trying to simplify it. And it's complicated in a frightening way, is what I mean. But there are currently 105,000 on-site storage locations throughout the prefecture. It used to be 150,000 different sites. But they're trying to convince you, 8,000 becquerels a kilogram is 500,000 per cubic meter. And so they're talking about a recycling method where they'll burn it and use it under roads and in farmland, and 99% they say could be used that way. So then they only got to deal with 1% of the 30 to 60 million one-ton bags. And thank goodness the locals objected. The ministry wanted to bury the radioactive dirty bombs under the pathways that run alongside of rice paddies. I mean, like if that doesn't scream, arrest me, I'm a mass murderer, what actually does? See, that kind of statement should never exist. The ministry, the government, the people you hired to do the opposite, wanted to bury the radioactive soil under pathways that run alongside the rice paddies. Well, I want to let that sink into you. Because that sentence shouldn't even exist in a Twilight Zone, let alone in real life. Let alone in a country that's supposed the third biggest economy on the planet, like Japan. So, like what I showed you so far tonight is unassailable proof this industry hates your guts and is going to murder you every which way it can. The country should be sealed off. It doesn't have a right to exist with the rest of the world. Its contempt for the rest of the world is lethal because this was the breadbasket. Just that single prefecture was producing 1 billion pounds of rice a year, and still is. It has no right. That country has no right to exist because it's a threat to the entire future of humanity. And it's unfortunately probably too late. But it's not too late to hold them accountable. Lessons learned from an extraordinary case of soil decontamination. And the guy who done this study, 9,000 square miles, which means, it's not in the tanks, right? Which is why we're going to poll tonight asking you, is it in the tanks? Are Fukushima 750 tanks meant to trick you into being complacent and thinking that nuclear hasn't destroyed the entire Pacific ecosystem? It's like really, truly a no-brainer. If you're honest, right? The work is the result of international collaboration led by no less than Olivier, Evrard, and we've covered him many times over the year. He's now situated at the Fukushima University, by the way. He's a terrible example of a human, like most academics. He's a horrific example of a human. He's the opposite of what any human would do. And he's doing it so that he can look people in the eyes and say, well, I'm a professor. That's their kick, right? And his job, obviously, from what we see out of this man, is to poison everybody everywhere forever. And they also mentioned in his study 20 million cubic meters, but he was in charge of that original story about this today where he said there's only 14 million. But there he is with an academic study saying there was 20 million at that time. When the reality of it was there was 30 million. Explosions targeting Kishida is terrorism, an attack on democracy. So this was a smoke bomb. Now it's an explosion. Now it's an attack on democracy. There is no democracy in Japan. If Japan was a democracy, we wouldn't be here today talking about it, would we? It's an authoritarian society that shuns women. It hates women, that's society. Its legacy of its crimes against women is probably second to none. It hates women. And it hates children, too, Japan as a society. There's good people in Japan, but not the system. The explosion constitutes interference in the election process. And that is the foundation of democracy. It is terrorism that could disrupt the political system. If you look up terrorism, that's what a journalist is today. They're a terrorist. And so a few months back, we celebrated Shinzo Abe getting taken out. It's one of the best moments of my life, actually. He has poisoned everybody worldwide for too many years. What he done to humanity is unbelievable. It's horrific. If anybody deserved to be assassinated, it was Shinzo Abe. On April 15, as the current nuclear idiot Kishida was about to make an election speech in support of a local ruling party candidate, a device was hurled at him by somebody in the crowd of listeners, followed by an explosion. And so security's on the ball this time. So they got into the ground, and he had another. These were smoke bombs. These weren't. But the journalist who wrote the article, because a lot of times when this kind of stuff happens, there's copycats who'll do the same thing. And so that's why they're framing the narrative the way they are. But this guy's not a terrorist compared to the journalist that wrote the story. Speaking out, Fukushima plant proven safe, says South Korea Daily. So your media is not really a friend, right? Because the media could have found everything I showed you tonight, and they only needed a fraction of it to debunk that statement right there. And so the major South Korea Daily has accused opposition parties' objections to the Fukushima nuclear plant treated water, using the word treated, believe it or not, water release of deviating far from the facts. First off, that media obviously should be disbanded. The building should be sold to pay outstanding debts, and the people that own it should be imprisoned for a very long time for sedition against their country. But these fine folks went to Fukushima. They couldn't get an appointment with anybody from TEPCO, or in the villages nobody would talk to them. They were told not to talk to them, obviously. And these are South Koreans. They couldn't get into Fukushima plant itself or nowhere near it. They were stemmed everywhere they went. Nobody would talk to them. Nobody would tell them anything. They were on a fact-finding mission. And so bless their hearts, because it really does sound like they were trying to get to the bottom of it, and that the industry made sure they could. Miss America is going to university to be a nuclear engineer. So she hates humans with a passion, right? And she talks about bananas. She was torn between being an aerospace engineer or a nuclear engineer in college. Her dad told her not to go look at nuclear, but because she was a rebellious kid, she went into nuclear. She said, I'm a nuclear engineer student. She's using her title to promote zero carbon nuclear. Nuclear's been portrayed as some high complex science, she said, when it's really not. She lists radioactive items like Americans use every day without knowing it, from smoke detectors, which shouldn't exist because you got americium-241 in it, to medical equipment, to naturally occurring radioactive particles, and you guessed it, bananas. I can't believe somebody actually said bananas this day and age. After all the people I stomped for years who used the word banana, and they literally got rid of it everywhere and stopped using it. When everybody used it, everybody. And I beat the daylights out of everybody 7 days a week if I wasn't out on research expeditions. But shame on her for claiming she's a human and conflating anthropogenic man-made radiation with a banana. Shame on you. I hope you break a heel. Disarming the persistent myths of a glowing nuclear renaissance. Nice pun. Disarming the persistent myths. No, it's panic. It's not myths, it's panic. The industry is panicking and trying to convince the investors that there's a nuclear renaissance. So the investors will buy stocks, they can sell theirs and retire, right? It's all about stealing everybody's stocks because it's legal, see? There is no nuclear. Nuclear is flat on his back with his feet up in the air, kicking and screaming non-stop every day. New Brunswick announces nuclear power partnership with Saskatchewan for small modular reactors that don't exist. Can support large established power grids and small grids and remote off-grid communities and resource projects. Yeah, but they don't exist. And these so-called small modular reactors, you're better off with geothermal, aren't you? Why would you do reactors when you could do geothermal? And you're not going to get them in everybody's communities like you're talking about. It's simply never going to happen. Zero possibility that they're going to have small modular reactors with mixed oxide fuel and all kinds. They're going to need 4,000 of them to replace the ones they got already on the planet, right? Which is the 413 reactors that are currently running. It's going to take over 4,000 of these small reactors to replace them. They're going to have reactors everywhere. And then they want to also use them individual for factories, and it's just all over the place. We've seen some of the crazies come out talking about they want to have 1,000 of them across Canada so people can charge their electric vehicles driving across the country. And they're going to pop them out in the middle of nowhere and walk away. Yeah, that's going to turn out really good with all the floods and tornadoes and hurricanes and Everything else, yeah. It won't take long before that goes south. What about you having a EM pulse from the sun? All of them break down at one time, melt down, and start hemorrhaging into the environment. In a news release, the province said the signed memorandum of understanding. The signed. We won't look at anything only nuclear. I don't care if it takes 1,000 years. We're only going to use nuclear. But see, that's not why we're paying electricity. We're paying the money into electricity to make sure that there's always something ready to go. Not your choosing, but something that's common sense. So the nuclear industry has captured the decision-making processes and have hijacked your futures. The big picture is clearly they expect the majority of the population worldwide to die off, otherwise they wouldn't do what they're doing. The province said a 300 megawatt small modular reactor, these are not small, this is 1/3 size of a massive reactor. They're the furthest thing from a small modular reactor. Of generating enough clean energy to power 300,000 homes. The province said. Which is captured by the nuclear industry in the 60s, right? Here in Canada. Environment group sues the EU over green label for gas and nuclear. Environment group. Environment. You're an environmentalist if you don't promote nuclear, then you're a target. Legal attack on the EU calling for nuclear power and gas sustainable. Well, they're going to court. Greenpeace is just one of the companies that are one of the lobbying groups which is taken over by the industry, right? And so they're meant to control the narratives. That's why they got the lawsuit. That's why the media is reporting on it. Deadline for public comment on the waste isolation pilot project permit closes on Wednesday. Without the permits, the expansion, the federal audit says the New Mexico nuclear waste storage site could be filled by 2025. Well, it's supposed to close down next year, right? They got an extension. But now they want to get an expansion. Now, you see the containers they're using, they're using that container, they say, to ship contaminated gloves and hammers and tools and stuff like that. Is gloves and tools and rags and sludge and soil and other contaminated objects with elements that are heavier than uranium, that are heavier, mostly plutonium. Think about that statement, those last two words, mostly plutonium. I don't think I've ever seen it framed that way before. So gloves should never be contaminated with plutonium, by the way, or tools, or rags, or sludge, or soils. And you're carrying it in these special containers, very heavy, very thick containers. So why are you carrying something that's considered very low level, like tools and gloves and rags? Like whoever used a rag and got it so radioactive you got to put it in a container would have died that month, because they use a lot of transient workers for these jobs, for 1 or 2 day workers. That's why you never want to let your loved ones work for these short jobs, because they'll send you out to these sites and get rid of your loved ones by poisoning them. Sites owned by the crazies, which run the radioactive waste disposal treatment for the country's nuclear weapons program. Radioactive waste disposal treatment. It's a really interesting way to frame that. Members of the public can submit written comments or requests to hold a public hearing on the hazardous waste, radioactive waste permit to the New Mexico Environment Department website, right there at that link. So that's tomorrow is the last day you can put. So you better, if you're going to comment, you need to do it tonight or tomorrow, early tomorrow. Japan should put more effort into containing nuclear tainted. And I showed you for the first hour that tainted. If it was tainted, I wouldn't even be here, for goodness sakes. Into the tainted water instead of the PR stunts, public relations stunts. There's 1,000 public relation firms that work for the nuclear industry. And they got no one to pick on, so I get the brunt of the abuse on a regular basis. Releasing nuclear contaminated water into seas of public important matter related to the marine environment. So they bought into the deception that I hopefully busted that earlier. It is sparing no effort in the public relations stunt to quell raging opposition both at home and abroad. Yeah, and like last night I got viciously attacked by a well-known attack dog from the industry by calling in and just assaulting me over and over and over. And we tried to give them an opportunity to tell us what it is they're so angry about, but they couldn't even articulate that. Tainted. Again, it's so offensive that they use a word that's completely inappropriate, like tainted, and treated. Every time you see the word treated or crippled, which is nuclear meltdown, these are... The term treated water is used to refer to the nuclear contaminated water, which is intended to downplay its pollution characteristics and potential hazards so as to achieve the purpose of confusing the public. Thank you very much. Well said. Way to go. About time. Somebody made sense in all these years. But then they fall back into it. They mention the words like treated and carbon and net zero and carbon and net zero and the expert group Net Zero Australia. That scares me every time I hear stuff like that. Net zero and carbon. Oh, and did I mention they mentioned net zero and decarbonizing and net zero and carbon? And they also mentioned net zero. So how are you supposed to have a conversation when they're putting all that effort into manipulating you and brainwashing you? Come across as the good guy, but then they proliferate the propaganda on you. Nuclear plant inspection documentation, one violation at the Callaway Energy Center. So they show you this picture. It doesn't really give you any context. So I looked up a picture, and you guessed it, surrounded by farms. The fuel pool is hemorrhaging radiation into the environment 24 hours a day. So their switchgear room air conditioning system broke down, and they were supposed to go into emergency mode. It should have been declared inoperable, but that wasn't done. And they required immediate actions to compensate for the failure of the air conditioning in the switch room to keep the heat down in the room, as well as other actions within 1 hour to place the plant in the hot standby for 6 hours. Neither of them took place, which is just standard for the industry not to do what it's supposed to do. There's no one to really, like, it's not like they're going to get held accountable. They're a corporation. You can't put them in jail. They're a corporation. No mutants allowed. A Fallout, a post-nuclear role-playing game retrospective. I couldn't make any sense of the story, to tell you the truth. This is a video game, I guess. Within hours, a nuclear play rendered 10,000 years of civilization into a radioactive dust. And this could be good, teaching children about radiation fallout, or it could be bad by disenfranchising them. We'll never know because I walked away from the story pretty quick as I could. Uranium Week. Uranium Week. Every year, uranium has a special week. Not Uranium Day, but Uranium Week. Which was really interesting. Again, the prices are still at $51 US, which is amazing that it got up to that. And it done that through deception. It got back up to $51, which is still way lower than what's necessary for the miners to make a profit. So the miners can't make a profit at $51. They'll go bankrupt, which is the best news we heard. But the investors will get manipulated and buy those stocks again. And they'll artificially inflate it somewhere the next short while. Investors will buy into it, think it's going up when it's all about robbing them. While there remains no chance of Australia or New Zealand embracing nuclear power, there remains no chance of Australia or New Zealand embracing nuclear power. But don't think they're not trying. Don't think Australia, the bad people in Australia, the pro-nuclear Australia won't be trying. Nuclear Waste Management Organization here in Canada, dollars will cost the community. Interesting things continue to occur in the municipalities of the South Bruce, which is Ontario, Canada. Do you really know what your municipal council is doing and the decisions they're making? Because the Nuclear Waste Management Organization want to put a repository in prime farmland. They actually bought 1,500 acres there. They want the farmers to keep farming each year, and they're going to be putting waste there for 60 years. And everything is vented on the way there and has to be repackaged when it gets there. And almost every nuclear power plant, nuclear dump is surrounded by farms for a specific reason. Two birds, one stone, right? They get you sick at the supermarket, and they put this underground eventually. It's all about poisoning you. The engineers, the surveyors have all worked diligently to put your reactors in prime farmland so they can poison you. G7 warns severe costs against countries aiding the Russia war in Ukraine. G7. So this is just a handful of people from 7 countries that are threatening the rest of the world. Canada has got 4 submarines. They're all at the West Edmonton Mall. Canada ain't gonna be beating up anybody. Look at all the crazies. Look at these people. We're better than everybody else on the planet. They have no concept of what it is to be a human. They really don't. County executives voice concern about Holtec Indian Point wastewater. So Holtec buys reactors that are shut down, and now they're in charge of private companies, so no one to hold them accountable. OSHA can't surprise inspect them because they're a publicly traded company, and so there you have corporate personhood to protect them. These are certain human rights that they're not supposed to have, right? That are piggybacked in on the slavery laws, which is illegal, 100% illegal. And so a fuel pool hemorrhages about 120,000 liters a day into the air every day for 60 years. And now that they got the fuel pool is finally empty of reactor cores apparently, because that's what they got in the fuel pools, they're still splitting the atoms, right? And so the water sucks up the atoms and then it evaporates up and releases the atoms into the environment to hunt you down for millions of years, because it never goes away. It's pulsing energy at the speed of light every second. County executives voice concern about Holtec's Indian Point wastewater plant because they don't understand that they've been poisoned for 60 years straight. Or they do, and this is a nice ploy to manipulate the population. Russia should worry. UK is sending depleted uranium bullets to Ukraine. And this was written by an Israeli, I guess. She's an Israeli. She tells lots of lies, lots of manipulations that we've already covered. Center for Security. She's an analyst for the Center for Security Policy, former Levy Fellow at the IDC in Israel. And so she's pro-military, like most Israelis, right? Last person you want to be trusting. Federal office explains the long search for nuclear waste repository in the United States. No, in Germany. So they expect it to be... They still haven't got a repository, but they finally shut all their reactors off on Saturday. So they expect that a repository won't be ready till 2060. That is 37 years. 37 years. 37 years, this stuff will still be hemorrhaging into the environment. Still splitting the atoms, right? Chinese police office bust in New York is the tip of the iceberg. Japan has the same kind of offices, right? They attack me on a regular basis from the embassies sometimes. Chinese police office, so you got the Chinese police have a secret office all over the United States, but they got one in New York where they caught them. And they harass any dissidents, any expatriates of the China, right, that are speaking out. Right, it's very scary stuff what we're talking about. But Japan is doing the same thing right now, particularly to people like me and Kevin Blanche, for instance, right? They're in our countries stalking us all the time. All of our theories, because you don't got no one else to pick on, see? You got to pick on somebody, you got to get a paycheck. You'd be surprised how many people I employ that are stalking me with the nuclear industry. That's their jobs, right, is to stalk shit disturbers, and there's only a couple of us out there. Less than what's on a single hand, right? You can count all the shit disturbers on a single hand worldwide that are honest. All of our theories of everything are probably wrong. So I spend a lot of my time, right, in quantum mechanics, string theory, alternative. Now, this is all theories, right? These are, until the next theory comes along, debunks the last ones. So it's the theory of everything, basically, is what they're trying to come up with. And they get pretty close, but there's always these little nuances. And it's usually these dysfunctional savants will do a mathematical equation that'll change the game. Like, I shouldn't say dysfunctional, they're functional savants, right? They're dysfunctional in every other facet of their lives. But they're functional when it comes to mathematics. And they're good with their memory, so they can remember textbooks, so they're really good for professors. And a lot of the universities, when these are coming through, the institutions will snatch them up and weaponize them and call them professors, right? And see, our child wasn't artistic, he was a professor. But in reality, they'll just weaponize the child, and the military will do it. CIA, FBI, CSIS in Canada, Mossad, and the MI6, and everybody else will seek out these vulnerable victims at the universities. They captured all of our universities a long time ago. So string theory, you got matter and dark matter, which will annihilate each other if they come in contact. So how can they exist in the same plane in that case, right? There's multi-universes. But what about the universe we live in right now? We ignore that one and hope for some other ones. We look to Mars instead of solving the problems on Earth. We go to Mars instead of the moon. None of it makes any sense. On one hand, we have quantum physics, quantum mechanics, which does an exquisite job of describing the fundamental particles, electromagnetic and nuclear forces, interactions that take place between them. And neutrinos are left-handed, And antineutrinos are always right-handed. Now, the recent study in Canada where antineutrinos were recorded 150 miles away from a nuclear power plant, 1.25 miles underground with thick rock in between it. So 150 miles away, 1.25 miles underground, and they were able to get the signal from the nuclear power plant, not the gas plant, not the oil plant, not the coal plant, but the nuclear plant. So how can you not be bombarded with this if you live within the 50-mile range? So if you've done studies within 15 miles of reactors of Alzheimer's and dementia and autism and diabetes and Down syndrome, heart problems, liver problems, lung problems, respiratory, pituitary, thyroid, adrenaline, etc., 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 you would see this absurd spike on all of it. There's usually 6 times more breast cancer within 15 miles of a nuclear power plant for females, right? Oh, and males, by the way. So the only way to describe a nuclear power plant is a perpetual disease factory. So if you look at it that way, then you'll have the right answers when you're thinking about it. Non-regulatory commissioners vote on regulatory framework for fusion reactors. Picking a byproduct material framework. Well, they can't quantify because they don't have one. Right? So everything is a conjecture because they actually don't have one. And this creature right here, I was listening to a interview he done last week. I downloaded it. I haven't got to him yet. He goes around where nuclear plants are closing and tries to keep them open. He does a whole bunch of coordinating. And his name is Mark Nelson, and he's got a company called Radiant Energy Group. He's just like Michael Schellenberg. He might even be better than Schellenberg, and Schellenberg is really good at being evil. He's exceptionally good at being evil, let's put it that way. Yeah, there you go. Now, I did have some headlines. We'll try to cover them while we're here. I don't think they're in any particular order, but we can. Contaminants are concentrated thousands of times in the food chain, and at the end of the food chain are humans. Releasing Fukushima radioactive water in the Pacific is inevitable. Very, very striking results shows radiation injury to the whole ecosystem. Therefore, it can't be in the tanks, right? Areas with 10,000 becquerels a square meter of radioactivity are considered highly contaminated. Not microsieverts, not millisieverts, but becquerels. And a becquerel is a physical atom pulsing energy at the speed of light every second. And each second, that's a becquerel, what they call a becquerel. So 30,000 square kilometers in Japan exceed those levels, exceed highly contaminated levels. So claiming that everything is in the tanks, and that's all I got to worry about and fight for, is what they're up to, see? Forget the truth. Pretend this is not happening. Fukushima plant is on chartered territories. Highly radioactive water to be either boiled until it evaporates or dumped in the ocean, 2013. So boiling it and evaporating a highly radioactive water, 2.2 sieverts per liter is what they're talking about, by the way, shows you this industry shouldn't exist. It absolutely, beyond any shadow of a doubt, is not supposed to exist. It only exists because good people are silent. And guess that's it. If you made it this far, make sure you give us a thumbs up. I'm going to close the poll down. Are Fukushima's 750 tanks, we counted them, right? And at the beginning of the show, I provide a whole lot of information about this. Are the 750 tanks, not the 1,000, but the 750 tanks, including small ones, of course, meant to trick you into thinking that nuclear hasn't destroyed the entire Pacific Ocean? And we got a wonderful 53 votes, 98%. Got a stunning 100% on their test. Bless your hearts. That's such an important poll, and I'm really happy that you participated in it. Well, thank you, everybody. I see James has sent off another donations. Bless your heart, man. Wow. Really, right? Wow, thank you. We'll do a shout-out maybe. We still got a few minutes left. Let me check the time here. We got 10 minutes before the show is typically over. Just my throat is a bit raw tonight. Good night, everybody. Albert, Don Vincent, 239 Giant. That's Joe. Hi, Joe. Port Angeles, Jesse. What are the dispersal patterns for the Northern Hemisphere? You don't need to ask anybody. I show that all the time. Here, I'll bring it up and show it to you again. Think of this model as, at the end of it, is around 20 days. Kevin Blanche was by. Hi, Kevin. Good night, everybody. I know I seen Colette last night and the night before. Hi, Colette. I know you're out there somewhere right now or tomorrow. Barks and Meows. And Richard, yeah, I got a video ready to go on that, Barks. Richard. And Danny San. Another CG. That's the follow pattern for the Northern Hemisphere. Somebody was asking her earlier. I'm just doing a quick shout out to everybody. Seems we've got a few minutes before I normally shut down. It's a little easier anyway on my throat when I... There's a lot of work today to get all these... There's three shows in a row of the news cycle, the 24-hour news cycle. So getting all the news in 24 hours and then coming out and doing a show on it, that's hardcore, folks. That's as hardcore. Nobby Noble, that's as hardcore as you're going to get, and that's all pertinent 24-hour news cycle that I'm bringing to you. And then we also had to bring you a whole bunch of information on the tanks, because that's heavily in the news lately. We're just getting up, almost up to the names. Finnegan. If I forget anybody or miss anybody, my apologies. Bubbly Blindy. After the show, when I read through the comments, when I do shows, I always seem to miss at least one people, and sometimes two. Never twice in the same people, twice in 2 shows in a row or something. Vast Thinker. And I'll come back to the most recent comments here in a second. I'm just going backwards up to the comments that are available on the inside. We're almost through. Savannah's 4th. Don Vincent. I know, Calm Down Charlie's probably out there somewhere. What a douchebag he turned into last night, eh? Charlie did. Somebody was there trying to protect him last night, claiming he had an American accent. I don't know what he would say, something like that. Everybody knows Charlie. Charlie's from Japan. He's hardcore Japanese accent. It was a fly-by night, right? John Curtis was there earlier. We're almost all the way up through. Hope I didn't miss anybody. We'll come to the most recent comments in a second. And I can't get all the way back to the original comments from the inside. I know James had left a comment last night, and it was nuclear wasting syndrome, I think it was, he had wrote. I put it in my list anyway. And I was thinking about it after, and I was Fukushima wasting disease is what all the birds and the whales and animals and mammals, when I talk about them in the future, that's probably what I'm going to refer to them as, because that was really important. 3 words, I think it was. Nuclear wasting syndrome, I believe it was. I wrote it down. And John Shiflett, Charlie plays with his rod. That's hilarious. Kevin Blanche, good night. Hugs for Kevin. Adam the Mushroom. Scarlet Bingonius. I gotta look that up after. I can't remember it off the top of my head. Did I get everybody? I'm just shooting back up to the most recent comments. I got you. Looks good. Yeah, Charlie was pretty funny last night. He went off on me, man. I let him exhaust himself, and he kind of ran out of steam. I just wanted, I tried to call him there a few nights before that, and they didn't answer the phone. We figured because he was probably molesting his puppy or something, right? Is that what pro-nuclear does? I'm sorry about that. But that's what they do, right? Like I said, I'd rather have them attacking me here than at home molesting their puppies. See you tomorrow night. Have a great night. Hugs for everybody. Don't buy Japanese under any circumstances. See everybody tomorrow night. Have a great night. Great day tomorrow. Take care, folks. Yeah, Fukushima wasting disease. I like it. Got potential for a t-shirt, minimum. See everybody tomorrow night. Take care, folks.